It's like you're dreaming about gorgonzola cheese when it's clearly brie time, baby. Step into my office.
Why?
'Cause you're fucking fired.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and we got the news this week that DC Comics fired co-publisher Dan DiDio on Friday. We streamed about it on the channel yesterday for comics aficionados, and there's a ton of information in there. And if you have the time, I would definitely suggest go checking that video out as well. It was a great panel discussion. I had Comics Perch on, Ash on Comics, one of my retail aficionados, Pele, Doc, who's a wealth of knowledge in the comic industry as well as Dylan from the Real Comic Book Gamer. But that is a 2-hour video, and not everyone has enough time to go check all of that out. So I want to talk about my thoughts on, at&t, Time Warner, firing DC Comics co-publisher Dan DiDio in this video, so it's just in one package, and if people are interested. So in here, I'm going to talk about the firing and my thoughts on it, what led up to it, some of the information that's out there. After that, I'm going to talk about one of the things that I think is really just dirty that's come out of this, and it's specifically from Bleeding Cool, and I'll get to that here in a few moments. After that, I'm going to address the 5G situation. I know there's a lot of people out there thinking maybe 5G is over with, and it's not going to happen now that Dan DiDio, this was his baby, that he's out the door, and I'll give my thoughts on that. And then I'll discuss who I think might be good replacements for Dan DiDio as far as the creative direction of DC Comics moving forward, and who might fit some of the prerequisites that at&t, Time Warner are going to want for the new person in charge of DC Comics, and then I'll wrap it up. So as has been reported, on Friday, Dan DiDio went into work. He was posting information and contacting, retailers per usual, and then he was fired. He was brought into the offices of Burbank, California, and he was let go. It definitely was sudden. He certainly didn't expect it. He wouldn't have been at work, acting as business as usual if that had happened. The timing of this was interesting because Comics Pro is going on up there in Portland. I guess none of the representatives from DC Comics that were at that event knew about it either, and they all quickly left. And this is also, right before C2E2, which DC Comics will have a big presence there. And also, 5G is right around the corner, so the timing is interesting. Some of the specific reasons that were cited as to why Dan DiDio was let go in the news reports was that he had, he'd fostered a bad working environment, and several members of the editorial team had quit recently. And it sounds like maybe HR was getting a lot of feedback about Dan DiDio's leadership style at DC Comics, and they decided it was time for a change. I've been talking about Dan DiDio's leadership and direction at DC Comics since I started the channel, a little bit over 1 year ago. Me personally, I think that Dan DiDio has a bad understanding of the DC Comics universe, and that he thinks that what makes DC special are things like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, these really dark, deconstructed Elseworld stories, that he's been trying to incorporate those elements into the DC universe, taking away the hope that is the DC universe, which is really the core of the DC universe and the DC characters, or at least the heroes. So it felt like he's been actively trying to go in that direction, just a much darker universe. Of course, that happened, when New 52 hit, which was a big hit and was a great decision by Dan DiDio in all actuality, at least in the beginning, because it was well received, fans were happy. But then all of a sudden, the DC heroes kind of became assholes, and people just got turned off to it real fast, and DC was in a bad spot. And then Jeff Johns got some creative control, and he started DC Rebirth, and that was a huge win for DC Comics. It felt like DC Comics returned to its roots. The core of what made the heroes special and the universe special had returned under Jeff Johns' leadership and vision, and people came back in droves. It felt like DC had kind of fixed itself. But then over time, Jeff Johns got a new deal with Time Warner where he dropped the chief creative officer role at DC Comics, and he was more involved in DC films. And, Dan DiDio was back in charge as far as creative control, along with Jim Lee. And it felt like when Dark Knight's Metal, which is a good event, I do wish it was Elseworlds, it hit. He tried to take advantage of that. Well, he didn't try. He took advantage of that. He steered DC back in another dark direction, which was a bad idea. But probably the thing that was even worse was bringing in Brian Michael Bendis. Brian Michael Bendis hasn't really had a hit comic in a decade now. He hadn't really had a hit at Marvel in a long time. His event Civil War II, as he was going out the door, was a huge flop. Nobody really enjoyed that. And it seemed like, along the way, Brian Michael Bendis just lost whatever it is that he had. But then DC, led by Dan DiDio, roll out the red carpet for him and bring him over. And Brian Michael Bendis is a notorious politicker. He came in and he started changing the culture at DC Comics. There's all kinds of reports of factions growing. There's the Tom King faction, the Brian Michael Bendis faction, the Scott Snyder faction, and they were kind of maybe not actively warring against each other, but they were definitely looking out for their own interest. And Dan DiDio helped Brian Michael Bendis create a pipeline over to Marvel Comics where he was funneling in all these terrible creators like, your G. Willow Wilsons, your Kelly Sue DeConnicks, your Matt Fractions, your David F. Walkers, all these failures, Sienna Grace, came over as well. All these failures at Marvel, and they brought him over to DC where they fit in even less as far as the characters in the universe goes. The enthusiasm wasn't there for readers, and sales went down. Batman sales were flat. Flash sales are terrible. Green Lantern sales are terrible. Wonder Woman sales are terrible. Bendis' own Superman sales are just god-awful, and that's all under Dan Didio's leadership and his direction, and I think that has a lot to do with this, and bringing in Bendis created a lot of, political maneuvering within the office, and it obviously rubbed some people the wrong way. We know Patrick Gleason, a great artist at DC Comics associated with Superman, he left over to Marvel. We had a bunch of editors quit, and now Dan Didio's out of a job. Am I happy he's out of a job? I don't want anyone to be fired. He's got a family and he has to take care of him. So, no, I don't want him to be fired. But he wasn't doing a good job, and I don't think that should be promoted or rewarded. And if you don't do a good job, if you fail at your job, you probably should expect to be fired. I expected him to be fired, so I'm not surprised about this. It did happen earlier than I expected, but I wish him the best of luck, and I'm sorry he had to lose his job, but he failed as the lead creative voice at DC Comics, and, creative is DC Comics. If you don't have good creative direction, you don't have a good, thriving, shared comic universe. And that's on Dan Didio, and I believe that's a big reason why he got fired, along with bringing in Brian Michael Bendis. It ended up creating an atmosphere, likely, of inter-office politics that rubbed people the wrong way, and you had people, complaining HR, you had people quitting, and they had to make a choice. So, them's the breaks, and that's how the world works. Now, as far as the Bleeding Cool thing that I said I was going to address earlier, so there's an article out there that's almost kind of trying to pin Dan Didio's removal from DC Comics on Scott Snyder. And this is just gross reporting. This is the kind of crap that TMZ even wouldn't report because it's unsubstantiated, and quite frankly, it's probably 100% bullshit. Yes, we know that Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo have death metal coming up, and that Dan Didio tried to get them to incorporate some of his 5G stuff into their event, and they pushed back and they said, listen, this is our event. We've been working towards this for, upwards of 10 years, and we don't want to include that in there because it doesn't fit. That is not trying to get Dan Didio fired. That is protecting the event that you've been working towards and ensuring that your readers get the best possible quality in the event that they're going to be paying for with your name on it. I don't blame Scott Snyder for this at all, but you sit there and you read this Bleeding Cool article, and it makes it sound like Scott Snyder, lobbied to get him fired. I don't believe that for a second. And when you look at Bleeding Cool and you think about their sources, who's worked at Bleeding Cool in the past? Well, Matthew Rosenberg, Donny Cates. Well, who was a huge influence at Marvel Comics when Donny Cates and Matthew Rosenberg arrived at Marvel Comics? Brian Michael Bendis. Who's at DC Comics right now that's created all this internal political strife and factions, within DC Comics, one of which is against Scott Snyder? We've seen Brian Michael Bendis actively try and undo what he did, in his Justice League Doom War, in his, Action Comics and Event Leviathan, things like that. He's trying to undo what Scott Snyder's been doing, and make it seem less important. Brian Michael Bendis. I wonder who Bleeding Cool's sources are for that, who's saying that, Scott Snyder is to blame for this. I don't know exactly the individual, but it's quite clear the camp that it's coming from. It's certainly coming from people close to Brian Michael Bendis who want to paint Scott Snyder as the bad guy, where it was Dan Didio, in fact, who's been championing Bendis from the start since he arrived. Bendis' hiring and the amount of influence that he was given at DC right away more than likely had an enormous part to play in Didio's firing. So, of course, Bendis is trying to protect his own skin, protect his own interests, and try to maybe turn some readers and creators against Scott Snyder. And I just think it's awful that Bleeding Cool will play a part in this. But if you do know who Rich Johnston is and you do know the site, it makes sense because they're all garbage there. I just think what Bleeding Cool is trying to do here in painting a bad light on Scott Snyder, like he was the one that got Dan DiDio fired, is just reprehensible and disgusting behavior, in my opinion. And can be completely traced right back to Brian Michael Bendis and his group of friends who, I hate to break this to you, are the sources that Bleeding Cool has when they say an anonymous source. They're talking about Brian Michael Bendis, and his Portland Mafia, his cabal of creators who basically worship him, and he's basically pipelined over to DC Comics. And of course, he still has some people over at Marvel as well. Now, I do want to address 5G. There's a lot of speculation or anticipation that maybe with DiDio out the door that 5G is canceled now. If you're expecting that, you're going to be very disappointed. 5G has been in the works for a while now. They've been building up towards this. We've got the DC Generation stories that are definitely coming out. I guarantee you the 5G stories are already in the pipeline as far as being written. Probably some of them are being illustrated at this very moment. They're likely too far down the tracks to go backwards now. So I'm almost 100% certain DC 5G is going to happen with or without Dan DiDio. Will it happen exactly as he had planned? Well, I don't believe so. I think there will probably be some changes to that. Maybe it will be shortened, will be adjusted. Maybe it won't be quite as big. Maybe they'll cut out some of the titles that are on the peripheral and maybe make it a little more streamlined, a little bit tighter, less titles, less creators. But, 5G is going to happen, and that's that. I don't think there's any way around it. I don't see any way DC Comics can change that now unless they want to, work their creators into the ground just to catch up and have comics ready, where they're not just delivering 20 new comics for 3 months straight. And, that would be a 75% decrease in comics for DC. So that would be insane. So if you're hoping that 5G is going to be canceled because of this, I do believe you're going to be very disappointed. As far as the people that could replace Dan DiDio in his creative role, I know that there's a lot of feeling out there that Geoff Johns would be perfect. And I agree with you. I don't think there's a creator out there, that's in his prime that understands the DC universe and what DC readers want more than Geoff Johns. Unfortunately, as I understand it, his star is rising at Warner Brother, in that studio as far as DC films. They've had a lot of hits on their hands. Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Shazam, all were received very well. Joker was a big hit. Birds of Prey didn't hit, but 4 out of 5 ain't bad, especially with the state of DC films, prior to that. So what it is I understand Geoff Johns is likely unavailable or doesn't have the time for a full-time DC Comics gig right now. Now, will he have input or maybe be an advisor in the creative process or to whoever is the creative director of DC Comics, in the future? Well, I would imagine so. One of the things that we heard that at&t wanted moving forward, when they replaced Dan DiDio, is more cohesion between the comic books and the movies and streaming services. So yes, it would make sense that Geoff Johns would have a role in there. Another person that I think would be, prime for a position here, maybe not exactly what Dan DiDio was doing, is Jeff Loeb. He has a good history at DC Comics. He's got a classic Batman story out there. He's got a lot of really good DC credits under his name, and he was also in charge of Marvel Comics' Netflix universe, which was very well received. People loved Daredevil. They really enjoyed Punisher. I believe Jessica Jones also had a good, strong audience as well. Not everything hit there, but generally speaking, it was well received. And Jeff Loeb would be a perfect person to have in there if you're wanting a more connected or cohesive DC Comics and DC, film and streaming universes that may be interconnected and had more characteristics as far as characters and presentation in common. You could do far worse than Jeff Loeb. So I imagine his name will be on the list as someone they want to, consider bringing in. As far as people that I would consider internally, I think Peter J. Tomasi would be great in a creative role, or maybe even just as, the editor-in-chief. Dan Jurgens would be great as well. I think Marv Wolfman, they should definitely consider Marv Wolfman. He would be great. He has the experience for it. He definitely has a love of the DC universe and DC characters. As far as people outside, I do think Dinesh Shamdasani would have been maybe the best choice. I think what he did with Valiant from 2012 to 2017 was brilliant and, the best, most cohesive, comic book universe in modern times. So I do think he would have maybe been the best choice, but he just announced that he has his own new comic book line coming up called Bad Idea Publishing, and so I don't believe he's available. I have heard people say they would like Jim Shooter brought in. If there was a bad working environment and they were getting complaints about the work environment under Dan DiDio, with the age of the creators and the new time that we're in, Jim Shooter would probably be fired within a few months, at least if his reputation at Marvel wasn't, in fact correct, that he was, a bit of a taskmaster and, someone that liked to crack the whip. I don't see that working in today's, corporate environment, and I think that they would get even more pushback for somebody like a Jim Shooter, although I do agree that he would be a good person to put in charge, and things would definitely get better under Jim Shooter, but I don't think they would even consider him. I don't think that he probably has the personality to work with younger people anymore. I don't think that they would be able to handle it personally. I can't really think of a whole lot of other comic people outside of DC that I would think would be really good fits for this. If you have ideas, please let me know in the comment section who you think should be in charge of DC Comics moving forward. And finally, I don't want to really just, trash Dan DiDio and everything it did at DC Comics. He was there for 20 years. He has a resume of success, and, he has a resume of failure, but he can definitely exit the building with his head held high, knowing that he did a good job, in certain aspects. It seemed like a lot of the creators at DC, really think fondly of him. It sounds like he was always willing to go to bat for them, and when it was time to take a bullet for one of his creators and say, that one's on me, he was willing to do that, and you have to commend him for that, because that's good leadership. It's unfortunate that kind of good leadership didn't really translate to the creative side as much. It sounds like, for the most part, he had his people's best interest at heart. I think he probably does regret bringing in Brian Michael Bendis. The sales that he brought with him certainly don't justify the size of the paycheck, the amount of influence, or probably all the interoffice politics that he brought with him as well. So I do believe that hiring Bendis was probably that final decision that really put the nail in the coffin, and that's probably why he's leaving DC Comics today. I think if he had not hired Bendis, DC would be in a much better place. The sales would absolutely be higher, and he probably would have had a happier work environment, with less, factioning off and interoffice politics, which I do think is ultimately what was his demise. And, it's too bad, but anyone could have told him that was going to happen, if he would have listened to the fans, and I think if he had talked to other creators who had been at Marvel, he probably would have known that was a bad decision. And Bendis is basically fool's gold nowadays, but hindsight is 2020, and I bet he wishes he could do that over again, but that's not really how the world works. And Dan DiDio is going to be moving on with his life, and I wish him the best, and I'm sure he'll be involved in the comic book industry. He has a track record of success, and he does have a track record of failure, but he is an insider. He has a lot of contacts, and I'm sure somebody's going to be wanting to scoop him up as somebody that can go in there and lead a team and probably be the creative director or a publisher or something like that. So I don't expect him to leave the industry. I think he'll find a soft landing somewhere. Maybe not for quite the coin that he was getting at DC, but I think he'll be doing just fine. And and maybe he can bring Brian Michael Bendis over there with him and see if it works out that time. But like I said, I wish him the best of luck. I am, as a DC fan, I'm happy because I think DC Comics is going to go in a better direction now. And it's too bad that it couldn't happen with Dan DiDio as part of it, but I think, over the past 4 or 5 years, it's been absolutely proven that when Dan DiDio was in charge of the creative direction at DC Comics, you have a failing DC Comics universe, and that's not what I want. So thank you very much for listening to this video. It was probably pretty long-winded, but I think I got out most of my thoughts and feelings on the situation and moving forward. Just so you know, there will be another video on this tomorrow from a different perspective, from another YouTube creator that I used to have disagreements with about whether Dan DiDio should be in charge at DC Comics and whether they needed a different creative voice leading them. His name's Robert. He's going to be on the channel tomorrow, so we'll get a different point of view on Dan DiDio's time at DC Comics, and I think you're going to enjoy that. And then I'll drop this because that'll have been 3 videos on the subject. That's more than enough to cover it. We got the big panel discussion. This video specifically addresses my thoughts on the situation, and then we'll get a different perspective, maybe not so much a rebuttal, but a different idea on Dan DiDio's performance at DC Comics and how, Robert feels about the firing. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I'll talk to you later. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews, and don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.